Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, before the rifles fired at Little Bighorn, the Lakota lived inside a world the history books rarely slow down enough to describe. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let your body settle into whatever is holding you right now. The mattress beneath you, the pillow against your cheek, the weight of the blanket across your shoulders. Feel how still the room is. Somewhere, very far from wherever you are lying tonight, there is a river valley. Wide and golden. Ringed by low hills that roll out in every direction like the slow swells of a sleeping ocean. The grass there is tall, waist-high in summer, and it bends in long, whispering waves whenever the wind moves across the plain. That valley has been there for a very long time. Longer than any name we might give it. Longer than the conflict that would one day make it famous. Longer, even, than the people who loved it most. Tonight, we are going to walk back into that valley. Not to the battle itself, not yet, but to the world that came before it. The long, deep, complicated world of the Lakota people. Their origins, their beliefs, their way of moving across the earth, and the slow gathering of forces, political, spiritual, environmental, and deeply human, that would one day converge on a warm June afternoon along a river called the Greasy Grass. There is no rush tonight. The story will unfold at its own pace, like smoke rising in still air. Let yourself drift. Let the words carry you gently backward through time. Part 1: The People of the Seven Council Fires. Imagine, for a moment, a fire burning in the dark. Not a large fire. A modest one, orange and amber, throwing warmth in a circle about as wide as a few outstretched arms. Around it, faces. Quiet faces, listening. The wind carries the smell of dried grass and pine smoke. Above, the sky is enormous and dusted with stars so thick and close that they seem to lean downward, as though curious about what is being said below. The people we call the Lakota did not always call themselves that. Or rather, the name they carry, Lakota, is simply the word for ally or friend in their own language. It is a word that speaks of relationship, of belonging to one another. They were part of a larger confederation, a great kinship of nations that English speakers came to call the Sioux, a name that originated as an outsider's corruption of an Ojibwe word, a word that carried connotations not entirely flattering. The Lakota themselves generally preferred their own name, and the name of their confederation, the Osidi-Sakowin. The Seven Council Fires. 7 fires. 7 council groups, each with its own dialect, its own territory, its own character, and yet all of them bound together by language, by kinship, by shared ceremony, and by a deep common identity. The easternmost of these council groups were the Dakota, sometimes called the Santee woodland people, accustomed to the forests and lakes of what is now Minnesota. Their world was one of canoes and wild rice, of forests turning gold in autumn, of winters spent in bark-covered lodges close to frozen rivers. In the middle were the Nakota, the Yankton and Yanktoni, a transitional people who moved between the woodlands and the open grasslands, carrying elements of both worlds with them. And to the west, the farthest west, were the Lakota, sometimes called the Teton Sioux. They were the largest of the 7 groups, and over time, the most deeply associated with the vast, open landscape of the Great Plains. The Lakota themselves were organized into 7 subgroups, sometimes called the 7 bands of the Teton Sioux. There were the Oglala, whose name means something like scattered or to scatter one's own. There were the Sikangu, the burn thighs, also known as the Brule. There were the Minikanju, the Hunkpapa, the Sanzark, those without bows, the two Kettles, and the Blackfoot Sioux, not to be confused with the separate Blackfoot Nation of the Northern Plains. It is important to understand, from the very beginning of this story, that the Lakota were not a single, uniform people moving in lockstep toward any particular destiny. They were a living, breathing, internally diverse civilization, full of disagreement and debate, full of remarkable individuals who held different visions of what the future should look like. Some of the most profound tensions in this story were not between the Lakota and the United States, but within the Lakota themselves. That internal complexity is part of what makes this history so deeply, enduringly human. Now, where did these people come from? The oral traditions of the Lakota offer one answer, and it is a rich and beautiful one. In the Lakota creation understanding, human beings came into the world from beneath the earth, from a sacred place, a world within the world, located somewhere in the Black Hills, the Pahasapa, those rounded, pine-covered mountains that rise suddenly from the prairie of what is now western South Dakota. The Black Hills were, in this understanding, the center of the world. The heart of everything. Western historians offer a different account, constructed from archaeological evidence, linguistic analysis, and historical records. In that account, the ancestors of the Lakota were woodland people, living in the region around the western Great Lakes, perhaps for many centuries, perhaps longer. Linguistic evidence suggests they were related to other peoples of the eastern woodlands, and that their movement westward onto the plains was a relatively recent phenomenon, beginning perhaps in the late 17th century, accelerating through the 18th. What drove that movement west? Many things. Pressure from the Ojibwe to the north and east, who were themselves acquiring firearms from French and British traders and using that advantage to expand their own territory. The draw of new possibilities. The slow, powerful lure of the buffalo. Because there was something on the Great Plains that would transform the Lakota completely. Something that, once encountered, would remake their economy, their spiritual life, their social structure, their entire relationship with the land. The horse. We will come to the horse in its proper time. But first, let us rest a moment in what we have just learned. 7 council fires. A people bound together by the warmth of shared language and shared ceremony. A people who trace their origin to the sacred hills at the center of the world. Let those images settle in your mind like dust settling in still air. Part 2: The Black Hills and the Sacred Geography of the Plains. There is a quality of light on the northern Great Plains, in the hour just before sunset, that is unlike the light anywhere else. The sky is enormous, truly enormous, in a way that can be disorienting to anyone accustomed to trees or buildings or the soft walls of a narrow horizon. The prairie stretches in every direction without interruption, and the sky stretches above it, twice as vast, so that you feel at the center of an immense and luminous bowl. And in that final hour of daylight, the light turns a deep, liquid gold. It catches the tops of the grass blades and makes the whole plain glow. And then, rising from that flat, golden world unexpectedly, almost impossibly, a dark mass of hills. Pine-covered. Ancient. So much older than the grass around them that they seem to belong to a different epoch entirely. This is the Pahasapa. The Black Hills. To stand at the edge of the plains and look toward those hills is to understand, immediately and viscerally, why the Lakota considered them sacred. They are not merely beautiful, though they are extraordinarily beautiful. They are the only prominent geological feature for hundreds of miles in any direction. They rise from the flatness like an island from a sea. They feel like a place that was placed there for a reason. In the Lakota worldview, they were. The Black Hills were the navel of the earth. The place from which life emerged. The place where the sacred and the everyday were closest to each other. Within the hills, and throughout the broader landscape of the Lakota territory, specific sites carried specific spiritual significance. Matotipala, the Bear's Lodge, known in English as Devil's Tower, a remarkable column of volcanic rock rising nearly 900 feet from the Wyoming plains, was a place of deep ceremony and story. In one of the most beloved Lakota stories, 7 young girls climbed onto a rock to escape a bear, and the rock rose up to carry them into the sky, where they became the Pleiades. The marks of the bear's claws, it was said, could still be seen in the rock's grooved sides. Wind Cave, in the southern Black Hills, was in some tellings the very place where the first people emerged into the world, where the buffalo, too, first came into existence. It is a real place, and a remarkable one, a vast underground cave system through which the earth itself seems to breathe, drawing air in and exhaling it through a narrow opening in the rock above. The Lakota did not simply live on the land. They lived within it. The landscape was not backdrop or resource, it was story. Every hill, every spring, every unusual rock formation was embedded in a web of meaning that connected the present moment to the ancient past, and to the world of spirits that moved alongside the visible world. This concept, the sacred interpenetration of the visible and invisible worlds, is central to Lakota spirituality and would remain central throughout everything that follows in this story. It shaped how the Lakota understood political decisions, how they understood warfare, how they understood the arrival of outsiders, and ultimately, how they understood what was at stake in the conflict of 1876. The Lakota spiritual universe revolved around the concept of Wakantanka, often translated as the Great Spirit or the Great Mystery, though neither translation quite captures the fullness of what the phrase contains. Wakantanka was not a distant, singular god in the way European monotheism conceived of the divine. It was more like a vast, pervasive sacredness, a quality of the universe itself, that manifested through many different spiritual powers and beings. The sky was Scan, the moving force. The earth was Maka, feminine and generative. The sun was Y, powerful and warming. There were the 4 winds, each with its own personality and domain. There were the thunder beings, the Wakinyan, enormous and formidable, living above the clouds. There were the spirits of the water, the Unkthi, powerful and sometimes dangerous. And through all of this ran the concept of the sacred hoop, the circle, which appeared everywhere in Lakota life. The teepee was round. The camp circle was round. The ceremonial dances moved in circles. The year was a circle. Life itself was understood as a great circle: birth, growth, death, and return. This is why, when the Lakota spoke of the world being broken, when things began to go wrong in the mid-19th century, they used the language of the circle being broken. The sacred hoop being damaged. It was not metaphor, or not only metaphor. It was a genuine spiritual diagnosis. But we are moving ahead of our story. Let us return to the land itself, and to the people learning to move across it. The territory that the Lakota came to occupy through the 18th and early 19th centuries was one of the richest ecosystems on Earth. The northern plains, stretching across what is now western South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, and parts of Nebraska contained vast rivers: the Missouri, the Platte, the Yellowstone, the Powder, the Tongue. Along those rivers grew cottonwood groves that provided shelter, fuel, and material for tools. The upland plains between the rivers were covered in the thick, nutritious grasses that supported the greatest concentration of large mammals on the continent. And above all, the buffalo. 60 million bison, by the most generous estimates, roamed the Great Plains in the early 19th century. The herds were so enormous that travelers described watching them for days from hilltops, unable to see the end of the moving dark mass below. The ground shook under their hooves. The dust of their passing could be seen from miles away. Their smell, warm and thick, like a barnyard scaled up beyond imagining, preceded them for miles on the wind. The Lakota built their entire civilization around the buffalo. Not in a dependent way, not in the way of people who had no other choice, but in the way of a people who had recognized, with deep wisdom, what a gift this creature was, and had organized their whole life to be worthy of that gift. We will speak much more of the buffalo and the horse in the sections to come. For now, let the image of that vast herd settle in your mind. Let the sound of it, low, constant, like distant thunder, fill the silence of your room. The earth breathes. The grass bends. The stars turn slowly overhead. Part 3: The Horse That Changed Everything. Picture a morning in late spring. Not yet summer, but the cold of winter fully gone. The grass on the hillsides is a vivid, almost impossibly bright green. A creek runs clear and cold through a shallow valley, and along its banks, a group of people are breaking camp. The teepees are coming down, large, perfectly engineered cones of tanned buffalo hide, folding into their poles in a practiced sequence that looks casual from a distance but contains generations of refined knowledge. And among all the activity, there is something new. Something that, just a century before, would not have been here at all. Something that has changed these people so completely, so quickly, that later historians would call it one of the most rapid cultural transformations in human history. Horses. Dozens of them. Tethered near the water, tossing their heads in the cool morning air. Their breath makes small clouds. Their coats are dark and bay and dappled. They are lean and strong, not the heavy draft horses of European agriculture, but the wiry, sure-footed horses descended from the animals brought to North America by the Spanish, animals that had gradually, through trade, raid, and escape, spread northward across the continent until they reached the plains. The horse arrived on the northern plains in force sometime around the early to middle 18th century. Some Lakota bands may have had horses as early as the 1720s or 1730s. By the mid-18th century, the transition was well underway. By 1800, the horse was so thoroughly integrated into Lakota life that it was difficult to imagine that world without it. What the horse gave the Lakota and the other plains peoples who acquired it around the same time was something close to a complete revolution. Before the horse, hunting buffalo on the open plains required elaborate cooperation. The most common method was the buffalo jump, driving a herd toward the edge of a cliff, panicking them so that they fell. Effective, sometimes spectacularly so, but seasonal, location-dependent, and requiring the coordination of many people. Another method was the impound, building a corral of brush and driving animals into it. With horses, everything changed. A skilled Lakota rider on a fast horse could run alongside a buffalo bull at full gallop, guiding the horse with his knees while drawing a bow or pushing a lance, close enough to touch the animal's flank. The hunt became something between a skill and an art form, demanding years of training for both rider and horse, demanding physical courage, and yielding results that made the old method seem laborious by comparison. The hunt became more reliable. The meat supply became more abundant. The hides, critical for teepee covers, for clothing, for trade, could be harvested in larger quantities. The material conditions of Lakota life improved substantially. But the horse did more than improve the food supply. It transformed the entire social and spiritual structure of Lakota life. Wealth became measurable in horses. A man with many horses was a man of standing. The acquisition of horses, through trade, through the gifting and counter-gifting of the giveaway economy, and through raid, became one of the central preoccupations of Lakota young men. Raiding enemy peoples for horses was not merely economic activity, it was a proving ground for courage, skill, and leadership ability. A young man who came back from a raid with horses brought honor to his family and demonstrated the qualities that would eventually make him a warrior, and perhaps a leader. The horse also transformed mobility. The great herds of buffalo moved across the plains following the seasons, following the grass, following patterns that only they fully understood. Before the horse, the people who lived on the plains could not easily follow those movements. With the horse, a Lakota band could cover 20, 30, 40 miles in a day. They could follow the herds. They could respond to drought by moving toward rain. They could pursue opportunities and avoid dangers with a speed and flexibility that was remarkable. The teepee itself, which had existed in some form before the horse, was now optimized for mobility. A well-constructed teepee of 12 to 15 buffalo hides could be dismantled, loaded onto a travois dragged by a horse, and carried across the plains with relative ease. The entire technology of Lakota camp life was elegant, portable, and designed for a people always in motion. Now, a word about the concept of nomadic life, because it is a word that is often used carelessly, in ways that suggest rootlessness, or a lack of attachment to place. The Lakota were not rootless. They were not wanderers in the sense of people with no fixed relationship to any landscape. They moved, yes, but they moved within a specific territory that they knew with extraordinary intimacy. They knew every significant creek, every sheltered valley, every good crossing on every major river. They knew where the grass was best in June, and where the best shelter was in January. They knew the seasonal patterns of the buffalo. They moved within their world the way a person moves through a familiar house, purposefully, knowledgeably, with a deep sense of belonging. Their relationship to the land was not one of ownership, in the European legal sense. But it was a relationship of profound attachment and responsibility. The land was not property, it was relative. It was alive. It had its own needs and its own rights. Moving through it was a form of relationship, not a form of exploitation. This understanding would become one of the deepest points of incomprehension between the Lakota and the United States government. When American negotiators asked, sincerely or otherwise, who owned which piece of land, they were asking a question that, in its deepest assumptions, was almost untranslatable into Lakota terms. But we are moving ahead again. The horse has arrived. The world of the Lakota is being remade. Let us rest in that moment of transformation. Let the image of horses moving across the long prairie grass carry you gently into the next part of our story. Part 4: The World of the Camp and the Teepee. There is a particular quality of light inside a teepee on a winter morning. Imagine lying still beneath a pile of soft buffalo robes. The air inside is warm, held by the careful engineering of the hide walls, which are staked to the ground around the perimeter and adjusted at the smoke hole at the top to manage the draft. Outside, you can hear the wind moving across the snow. But inside, you are held. A small fire burns in the center of the floor, its smoke rising in a slow column toward the opening above. The light it throws is amber and shifting, and it falls on the objects arranged carefully around the circular interior. Parflutch bags, rawhide containers decorated with geometric designs in red, blue, yellow, and green hang from the lodge poles. A backrest of willow sticks, woven together and tilted at a comfortable angle, leans against one side. The smell is of hide, smoke, dried meat, and something warm and earthy beneath it all. The teepee was one of the most ingenious pieces of engineering ever developed by any people on Earth. It provided excellent insulation against both cold and heat. Its conical shape was aerodynamically stable in the fierce winds that swept the plains. It could be erected by a pair of experienced people in under an hour. It could be packed down and loaded onto a travois in roughly the same time. And it was beautiful, its exterior often decorated with paintings of battle honors, spiritual visions, and geometric symbols, each one specific to its owner and their history. Life within the camp circle, the Tiaspe, the band, was the organizing unit of Lakota social life. A band might include anywhere from a few dozen to several hundred people, all of them related by blood, by marriage, or by long association. The camp circle was not merely a physical arrangement of lodges, it was a living symbol of the sacred hoop, with each family's place within it carrying social and spiritual meaning. Leadership within the band was not inherited, or not simply inherited. It was earned and sustained through demonstrated qualities, generosity, wisdom, courage, and the ability to counsel well. The Atankin, the chief, the headman, held authority through the consent of the people. A leader who made poor decisions, or who grew selfish or arrogant, could simply find that people stopped following him. A good leader was often distinguished not by how much he accumulated, but by how much he gave away. This is worth pausing on, because it represents a fundamentally different model of leadership than the one being practiced in Washington or in the Army during this same period. A Lakota headman's status was continuously renewed through his relationship with his community. A general or a senator held authority through institutional rank, regardless of whether the people below him respected him. These were genuinely different ways of organizing power, and they would produce very different kinds of behavior when the two civilizations came into conflict. Within the band, decisions were made by council. The headman and the elders gathered, and everyone who had something to say had the opportunity to say it. Consensus was the goal, not majority vote. A decision that did not have broad support was a weak decision, no matter how logically it had been argued. This meant that Lakota political processes were slow by some standards, and that forcing a decision on a group against their will was not really possible. It also meant that agreements reached through consensus tended to be deeply held and long-lasting. The camp was also organized by gender in ways that reflected a complex and not simply hierarchical division of labor. Women were responsible for the teepee, its construction, its maintenance, its breakdown and re-erection at each new campsite. This was not a subordinate role. The teepee belonged to the woman who had made it. Women were skilled tanners, creating the soft, creamy white hides from which the teepee cover was made through a laborious process of scraping, soaking, and working the hide over many days. Women were also the preservers of meat, making wasna, the pemmican-like preserved food of fat and dried meat, that could sustain a person through the long months when fresh food was unavailable. Women also held significant spiritual and social authority. The white buffalo calf woman, the sacred figure who, in the most important Lakota origin story, brought the 7 sacred rights to the people, was feminine. The earth itself, Maka, was feminine. The transfer of sacred objects, the keeping of family honor bundles, the maintenance of ceremonial responsibility, these things often rested with women. Men's primary roles were warfare and the hunt. From early boyhood, Lakota boys learned to ride, to shoot, to read the land and the weather and the behavior of animals. They were trained to endure discomfort, cold, hunger, pain with equanimity. The ideal of the Lakota warrior was not a raging berserker but a controlled, skilled, courageous person who could act decisively under pressure while also showing wisdom, restraint, and care for the people depending on him. Warrior societies, the Akasita, played an important role in camp life. These were fraternal organizations with spiritual dimensions, named for animals or natural forces. The Kit Fox Society. The Crow Owners. The Strong Heart. The Badger. Each had its own regalia, its own songs, its own ceremonies. Members pledged to protect the camp, to uphold the rules of the hunt and the council, and in battle, to fight with particular courage. The most honored members pledged never to retreat, staking themselves to the ground in battle with a special sash, giving themselves completely to their commitment. The Akasita also served as a form of camp police. During the communal buffalo hunts, they enforced the rules that prevented any individual from rushing ahead of the group and scattering the herd before everyone had the chance to participate. This kind of coordinated regulation of individual behavior for the collective good was one of the remarkable features of Plains life, evidence that the freedom of Plains existence coexisted with a sophisticated understanding of mutual obligation. Above all, through all the rhythms of camp life, ran the deep pulse of ceremony. The Sun Dance. The Sweat Lodge. The Vision Quest. The Pipe Ceremony. These were not peripheral activities, reserved for specialists or special occasions. They were woven through the everyday fabric of Lakota life. Prayers accompanied the morning's first smoke. The hunt began with ceremony and thanks. The dead were mourned with ceremony. Children were welcomed with ceremony. The seasons turned, and ceremony marked each turn. All of this, the camp circle, the councils, the warrior societies, the women's craft and authority, the ceremonies, all of it was the living civilization of the Lakota. Complex, flexible, deeply intelligent, and deeply human. And it was a civilization that, in the middle of the 19th century, was about to face the most severe test in its history. But not yet. Let us stay a little longer in the warmth of the fire. Part 5: The Great Buffalo Economy and the Flowering of Plains Culture. Think of an August morning on the northern plains. The sun has been up for 2 hours, but the air is still cool enough to feel good on your skin. The sky is a deep, unbroken blue. Somewhere to the north, a line of cottonwood trees traces the path of a river you cannot yet see, their pale green leaves shimmering in the earliest breeze. And then, over the low ridge to the west, sound begins before sight. A low, continuous rumble, not quite like thunder, more like an enormous drum being played very, very slowly. The ground beneath your feet begins to tremble. Small pebbles jump and settle. The horses in camp lift their heads, ears forward, nostrils wide. The buffalo are coming. To understand the Lakota in the mid-19th century, to understand why the conflicts that were coming were so catastrophic in their implications, you must understand what the buffalo represented. Not simply as food, though it was the primary food. Not simply as economic resource, though it was that too. The buffalo was the foundation of an entire world. Consider what the buffalo provided. Meat roasted, boiled, dried, pounded into wasna was the dietary staple. Every part of the animal was used. The hide became teepees, clothing, moccasins, bedding, carrying bags, drumheads, shields, and boat coverings. The bones became tools, knives, scrapers, needles. The sinew became bowstrings and thread. The stomach became a cooking vessel. The tongue was a delicacy. The marrow was a rich, nutritious food extracted from the cracked long bones. Even the dung dried buffalo chips was fuel, burning with a steady, low heat on a prairie where wood was scarce. A single large bull could yield over 400 pounds of usable meat, and a hide of considerable value for trade or domestic use. A successful communal hunt could yield enough preserved meat to sustain a band through the winter. The relationship between the Lakota and the buffalo was not simply economic, it was profoundly spiritual. The buffalo was a relative, a being that had chosen to give itself so that the people could live. That gift was acknowledged with prayer, with ceremony, with the careful use of every part of the animal, and with the understanding that the relationship must be maintained through respect. The sun dance, the most sacred of Lakota ceremonies, was partly a renewal of the covenant between the people and the buffalo. It was performed in midsummer, when the whole nation, or large portions of it, gathered together. Bands that had been scattered across the plains through the winter came together, renewed their relationships with one another, arranged marriages, traded, heard news from distant places, and performed the great ceremony that affirmed their connection to the sacred powers of the universe and asked for the continuation of life. The sun dance was demanding. Pledgers, those who had made a vow during the previous year, often in exchange for a healing or a deliverance, danced for days around a central pole, a specially chosen cottonwood tree that served as the axis between earth and sky. Some pledgers pierced their chest or back skin with wooden pegs, attached by ropes to the central pole, and danced against the resistance of those ropes until the skin gave way. This was not masochism, it was sacrifice. It was the offering of pain and blood to the sacred powers, asking them to receive the prayer and respond. To an outside observer, the sun dance could appear alarming. To participants and witnesses from within the tradition, it was among the most beautiful and moving experiences of their lives. The prayers were genuine. The community gathered around the pledgers was their family, their whole world. The willingness to sacrifice, to give your own comfort and safety for the sake of the people, was the highest expression of Lakota values. Beyond the Sundance, the vision quest, the Hanbalsia, that crying for a vision, was a practice undertaken by many individuals, particularly young men seeking guidance as they moved into adult life. A vision quester would go alone to a remote and elevated place, a hilltop, a rocky promontory, and remain there for 4 days and nights without food or water, praying for a vision, for a sign from the spiritual world that would reveal something of his purpose and his gifts. These visions were taken with complete seriousness. A young man who received a powerful vision, a dream of thunder, an encounter with a spirit animal, a message conveyed in an incomprehensible but deeply felt form, carried that experience with him for the rest of his life. It might shape his name. It might determine which ceremonial society he joined. It might define his role within the community. The vision was real, in the most important sense, not because it could be verified, but because it was lived and acted upon. Among the most remarkable spiritual figures in Lakota life were the Hyoka, those who had received visions of the Wakinyan, the Thunder Beings, and who were therefore required to live as sacred contrarians. The Hyoka did everything backward. They said the opposite of what they meant. They shivered and complained of cold and summer heat, and sweated and complained of heat in the depths of winter. In ceremony, they provided comic relief that was simultaneously deeply serious, a reminder that the sacred and the ridiculous were not as far apart as one might assume. The world of the spirit was not solemn. It was strange and vast and sometimes very funny. All of this, the sun dance, the vision quest, the Hyoka, the pipe ceremony, the sweat lodge, constituted a religious life of extraordinary sophistication and depth. The Lakota were not primitive in any meaningful sense of that word. They were people with a complex theology, a rich ceremonial calendar, and a spiritual practice that demanded real effort and real sincerity. And their material culture, in the mid-19th century, was at something of a high point. The combination of the horse and the buffalo had produced, during the 18th and early 19th centuries, a flourishing of Plains culture that historians sometimes describe as the classic period of Plains Indian civilization. The populations of the Lakota bands were growing. Their territory was expanding, they had pushed westward and southward, displacing or incorporating other peoples as they went. They were formidable in war. Their trade networks were extensive. They were, by the standards of their world and time, a powerful and successful people. They were also, by the early 19th century, beginning to have more regular contact with a world that would eventually overwhelm them. Not yet, not for some decades. But the early tremors were already being felt. Let us allow those tremors to reach us slowly, gently, as we move deeper into the night. Part 6, First Contacts and the World Shifting Beneath. There is a painting, made by the American artist George Catlin in the 1830s, of a Mandan village on the upper Missouri River. It shows earth lodges arranged in a compact, defensive cluster on a high bluff above the river. The people in the painting are beautifully dressed. There is a ceremonial gathering in progress. The sky above the village is wide and pale blue. Catlin was one of the first artists to travel into the deep interior of North America with the specific intention of documenting the peoples he found there. He was not unbiased, no one is, but he was genuinely moved by what he saw, and his paintings and writings provide one of the most detailed early records of Plains life in the years before the Great Disruptions. What Catlin could not fully see, or did not fully record, was the catastrophe that had just swept through the Mandan people, and that had already, silently, been reshaping the entire landscape of Plains relations for decades. Smallpox. European diseases, smallpox, measles, typhoid, and others for which indigenous populations had no inherited immunity had been moving ahead of European settlement like an invisible wave for centuries. They traveled along trade networks, carried by traders and intermediaries who might themselves be only mildly sick, while the people they visited, encountering these pathogens for the first time, died in terrible numbers. The epidemic of 1837 nearly destroyed the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Arikara, three peoples who had lived in substantial, semi-permanent agricultural villages along the upper Missouri for centuries. The Mandan, once numbering perhaps 10 or 15,000, were reduced to a few hundred survivors. Within a matter of months, a civilization that had persisted for centuries was reduced to a remnant. This catastrophe had profound effects on the balance of power across the entire northern plains. The agricultural peoples of the Missouri Valley, who had been important trading partners for the Lakota and other nomadic groups, were suddenly weakened to the point of near extinction. The Lakota moved into territories that had previously been occupied, pressed further westward and southward. The political geography of the plains was remade in just a few seasons. The Lakota, for complex and not fully understood reasons, fared better than many other peoples in the smallpox epidemics of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. They suffered losses, certainly, but not at the scale that destroyed the Mandan. Some historians have attributed this partly to their dispersed, mobile lifestyle, which may have slowed transmission. Whatever the reason, the relative resilience of the Lakota during the epidemics contributed to their growing dominance on the northern plains. But disease was only one of the forces arriving from the east. The fur trade had been reaching into the upper Missouri and the northern plains since the late 18th century. The American Fur Company and its predecessors established trading posts, the forts, at intervals along the Missouri, Fort Pierre, Fort Union, Fort Berthold. At these posts, Lakota traders could bring buffalo robes and receive in exchange metal pots, knives, awls, and cloth, the material goods of the industrial world that gradually, piece by piece, began to enter plains life. The first formal diplomatic contact between the Lakota and the United States government came in the early 19th century. Lewis and Clark, on their famous expedition of 1804 to 1806, encountered Lakota bands along the Missouri River and had tense, difficult interactions with them. The Lakota, specifically the Teton Sioux, the Hunkpapa and Sicango bands, were accustomed to controlling river traffic through their territory and demanding a form of toll from traders passing through. Lewis and Clark refused to pay, tensions rose, and the encounter ended without violence but without warmth. Clark's journal entries about the Lakota were not flattering, and his opinions were remembered in government circles. When the United States began to formulate its Indian policy for the northern plains in the coming decades, the reputation of the Sioux as the most troublesome of the plains peoples was already establishing itself in American governmental memory. The formal relationship between the United States and the Lakota was not fully established until much later. The first significant government-to-government contact came through the horse and fur trade, through the occasional meeting of traders and government agents, through the slow, tentative, often mutually suspicious process by which two very different civilizations began to recognize each other across the enormity of the plains. Through the first half of the 19th century, the Lakota continued to expand their territory and their power. They pushed the Crow and the Pawnee and the Shoshone from territories they wished to occupy. They raided southward into territory claimed by the Comanche. They fought the Ojibwe to the north and east. They were, by any external measure, a powerful force, confident in their world, centered in their identity, moving across the plains in the long seasonal rhythm that their lives had perfected. But below the surface of that confidence, in the middle distance of the future, something was building. Something that would arrive with a speed and a force that no one, not even the most far-seeing among the Lakota leaders, could fully anticipate. Emigrants. The westward movement of the American people. The Oregon Trail. The California Trail. The paths to Mormon Utah. The Gold Rush. The mass migration of European Americans across the continent. Beginning in the 1840s and accelerating through the 1850s, the great tide of emigration began flowing across the plains. The people moving west were not, in most cases, interested in the plains themselves. They were passing through on their way to California, or Oregon, or Utah. But their passing left marks. The wagon ruts cut through the grass. The fires burned the prairie. The emigrant cattle and horses competed with the buffalo for grass. The game along the major trails was shot and depleted year by year. And then, word began to arrive of something even more alarming. Not people passing through. People arriving. People who intended to stay. The world was shifting. And deep on the northern plains, around the fire, in the long councils of the band leaders, the questions were beginning. Part 7, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 and the Promise Made. In the late summer of 1851, 10,000 people gathered on the plains near Fort Laramie, in what is now southeastern Wyoming. 10,000 people. Think about what that means on an open prairie. The lodges spread out in every direction as far as the eye could see. The horses, perhaps 50,000 of them, had stripped the grass for miles around the fort within the first week, and the whole gathering had to move several miles to find enough forage for the animals. The smell of that many cook fires, that many horses, that many people living and eating and moving, must have been extraordinary, dense and smoky and alive. They had come from all directions. The Lakota were there, all the major bands, represented by their headmen. The Cheyenne were there, old allies of the Lakota and respected as among the finest fighters on the plains. The Arapaho were there, friends and frequent companions of the Cheyenne. The Crow came. Despite the fact that the Crow and the Lakota were enemies, they came under the promise of safe passage that the gathering represented. The Shoshone came from the mountains to the west. The Hidatsa and Arikara came from the Missouri. The Assiniboine came from the north. It was, in its way, an astonishing moment. Peoples who were enemies met, under a kind of collective truce, to participate in a negotiation with the government of the United States. The government was represented by Thomas Fitzpatrick, a veteran mountain man turned Indian agent, who knew the plains well and who had, by most accounts, a genuine respect for the peoples he was dealing with. He was assisted by a team of interpreters and a contingent of soldiers from the fort. The goal of the United States, as stated, was to establish peace among the Plains nations, to ensure safe passage for emigrants along the trails, and to identify clear boundaries for each nation's territory. The government wanted to be able to say, this land belongs to these people, that land belongs to those people. Neat, legible, administratively manageable. For the Lakota, and for most of the other nations present, this concept of fixed territorial boundaries was not exactly how they understood the relationship between people and land. Territory had always been contested, fluid, negotiated through strength and diplomacy and seasonal movement. The idea of a line on a map that permanently defined your nation's territory was a European import. But the leaders who came to Fort Laramie in 1851 were not fools. They understood that the United States was a powerful and growing force. They understood that the waves of emigrants crossing their lands were not going to stop on their own. They had been promised gifts, annuities of goods, paid annually in exchange for their agreement. The goods were real and useful: metal tools, cloth, guns, ammunition, food. And so the treaty was made. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, sometimes called the Horse Creek Treaty, defined the territory of the Lakota as a vast region encompassing much of the northern plains, including the Black Hills and the Powder River country of what is now Wyoming and Montana. In exchange, the Lakota agreed to allow safe passage along the emigrant trails, to refrain from attacks on emigrants, and to accept the defined boundaries of their territory. From the Lakota side, this was understood as a specific, limited agreement. They were not surrendering sovereignty. They were not agreeing to be governed by the United States. They were agreeing to a set of mutual obligations: peace for goods, safe passage for defined territory. If the United States upheld its end of the bargain, the Lakota would uphold theirs. The United States Senate, in ratifying the treaty, altered its terms. The duration of the annuity payments was reduced without the consent or even the full knowledge of the signatory nations. The boundaries that had been agreed upon were adjusted. This patterned negotiation, agreement, ratification with altered terms, and eventual non-compliance would repeat itself so many times in American Indian Treaty history that it became almost predictable. But in 1851, the hope was genuine on both sides, if differently understood. For the headmen who signed at Fort Laramie, men like Conquering Bear of the Brule Lakota, there was real optimism. The government had acknowledged Lakota territory. It had made promises. Perhaps those promises would be kept. Within 3 years, that optimism had been shattered in a single violent afternoon. In August of 1854, a young second lieutenant named John Grattan led a force of 29 soldiers and an interpreter into the Brule Lakota camp near Fort Laramie to demand the surrender of a Minneconjou man named High Forehead, who had killed a Mormon emigrant's stray cow. Conquering Bear, the band headman and one of the signatories of the 1851 treaty, attempted to mediate. He offered horses in compensation for the cow. He urged patience. Grattan, young and arrogant and deeply contemptuous of the people he was supposed to be negotiating with, refused. He ordered his men to open fire on the camp. Conquering Bear was killed in the opening volley. The Lakota warriors surrounding the camp, many hundreds of them, responded immediately. Grattan and every one of his soldiers was killed. The interpreter was killed. The only survival was a soldier who died of his wounds a few days later. The massacre at Fort Laramie, or the Grattan Massacre, as it was called in American accounts, did not end the relationship between the United States and the Lakota. But it fundamentally changed the nature of that relationship. The promise of Fort Laramie had been tested and broken, not by the Lakota, but by the arrogance of a single young officer. And in the aftermath, the United States did not seek reconciliation. It sent more soldiers. In September of 1855, General William Harney led a force of 600 soldiers in an attack on a Brule Lakota village at Ash Hollow, in what is now Nebraska. The village was attacked at dawn. 86 Lakota were killed, most of them women and children caught in the opening assault. 70 women and children were taken prisoner. Among the Lakota, this attack would long be remembered by the name they gave Harney, the Butcher. The lesson being learned, on both sides, was that the relationship between the United States and the Lakota would ultimately be resolved not by negotiation but by force. The question was how much force, and when, and what it would cost. That question would take another 20 years to fully answer. And in those 20 years, extraordinary things would happen. Wars, treaties, gold, and the rise of leaders whose names would echo through history. Part 8, Sitting Bull, the Man and the Vision. There is an image that has come down through history, through photographs and portraits and the accounts of those who knew him. A broad face. Dark, steady eyes that seem to be looking at something slightly beyond the horizon of what is directly in front of them. A composure that is not coldness, it is something closer to an immovable patience. The patience of a man who has decided what he believes, and who no longer needs to be in a hurry about it. Sitting Bull. Tatanka Iotake. whose name, literally translated, describes a buffalo bull who sits on its haunches and refuses to move, stubborn, immovable, with the weight of the earth behind it. He was born sometime around 1831, in what is now northern South Dakota. He was Hunkpapa Lakota, one of the northernmost and most independent of the Lakota bands, a people who had less contact with the trading posts and emigrant trails than the bands farther south, and who therefore retained, longer than some others, the full force of their traditional life and their traditional values. His birth name was Jumping Badger. The name Sitting Bull came later, earned through an act of courage in battle, though the exact story is told in different ways by different sources. What is consistent across all the tellings is that the name felt right, felt like a true name, the kind of name that revealed something essential about the person who carried it. Sitting Bull was, from childhood, remarkable. He counted his first coup touching an enemy warrior in battle, the highest mark of courage in the Lakota warrior tradition, at the age of 14, riding alongside a Crow warrior in a raid on a Crow village. After that act, his father, also called Sitting Bull, gave his son his own name in recognition of the honor. Over the following decades, Sitting Bull grew into one of the most respected figures in Lakota life, not only as a warrior, though his warrior credentials were extraordinary, but as a spiritual figure, a holy man, a man of vision. He was a Wachashawakan, a sacred man, someone who had received powerful visions and who had demonstrated the ability to translate those visions into guidance for his people. He was also a singer. He composed songs, some of them ceremonial, some of them personal, some of them playful, and his songs were sung throughout the Lakota world. He kept a pictographic record of his own life, drawing the significant events, battles, visions, hunts, in a way that later historians would use to reconstruct portions of his biography. By the 1860s, Sitting Bull was the leading figure of the Hunkpapa band and one of the most influential men on the northern plains. He had opposed American expansion consistently and completely, not from simple militarism, but from a clear-eyed understanding that the American goal was not coexistence but replacement. He watched what happened to the bands who signed treaties and moved to reservations, and he drew conclusions. He never signed a treaty with the United States. This was a principled position, maintained consistently through enormous pressure. When other leaders counseled accommodation, Sitting Bull argued for independence. When the government sent representatives to persuade him to lead his people to a reservation, he sent back polite but unequivocal messages: "This land is ours. We are going nowhere." But Sitting Bull was not simply a man of war. He was a man of ceremony, of prayer, of deep spiritual seriousness. He believed, genuinely and completely, that the sacred powers of the universe would provide for his people if they kept faith with their ceremonies, their values, and their way of life. His resistance was not merely political, it was spiritual. To surrender the Lakota homeland was not merely to lose territory, it was to sever the connection between the people and the sacred world that sustained them. He adopted a man named Jumping Bull, a Crow prisoner who had been taken as a child and raised among the Hunkpapa, as his brother, demonstrating that his sense of family was not bounded by blood. He was known for his generosity. He gave things away consistently, the mark of a good Lakota leader. He once gave away his last horse to a poor family in his camp and walked home on foot without complaint. His spiritual authority would become crucial in the coming years. In the time of crisis that was gathering on the plains, the Lakota needed leaders who could hold the community together not only through military skill, but through the force of moral clarity. Sitting Bull was that kind of leader. He was not alone. Around him gathered other remarkable men. Crazy Horse Tashunka Witko, who was Oglala Lakota, and whose story is in some ways even more mysterious and compelling than Sitting Bull's, because Crazy Horse left almost no direct account of himself. No photographs, he refused to be photographed, believing the camera captured something of the soul. No treaty signatures. No recorded speeches of length. He spoke rarely and quietly, and his life was lived almost entirely in action. He had received, as a young man, a vision that shaped everything that followed. The vision showed him a figure riding a horse that changed colors, moving through a hailstorm, with a small stone behind his ear and a hawk's feather in his hair. He understood the vision as a guide to how he should fight, always in motion, never stopping, never afraid. He wore no war paint into battle, dressed simply, and led from the front with a recklessness that seemed, to those who fought alongside him, almost supernatural. Crazy Horse was beloved by his people in a way that went beyond admiration for his military gifts. He was known for his care for the poor and the elderly. He shared everything. He was quiet in a way that the Lakota valued, not closed off, but self-contained, with a quality of attention that made people feel seen and heard. There were others. Gulp Pizzi, a Hunkpapa war leader of ferocious effectiveness, who had survived a near-death at the hands of soldiers who had bayoneted him and left him for dead, and who had risen from that experience with a settled fury that would be formidable in battle. Tumoon, the Cheyenne leader, who would be among the Allied forces at the Little Bighorn. Lame White Man, another Cheyenne warrior of great reputation. All of these men were living and leading in a world that was under increasing pressure. Let us look more closely at the nature of that pressure. Part 9, The Red Cloud War and the Second Fort Laramie Treaty. There is a road that does not exist anymore, in the physical sense, or rather, it exists now as a series of county roads and ranch tracks in faded ruts in the grass that you would need someone to show you before you could find them. But in the 1860s, the Bozeman Trail was one of the most contested pieces of land in North America. John Bozeman, a Georgia-born prospector, blazed his trail in 1863 as a shortcut to the Montana gold fields. It ran from the Oregon Trail northwestward, cutting directly through the heart of the Powder River country, the territory specifically guaranteed to the Lakota by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. It was prime country, well-watered, rich in game, sheltered from the worst of the winter winds. It was the most important hunting territory the Lakota possessed. The United States Army, understanding that emigrants would use this trail regardless of the treaty, began building forts along it in 1865. Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, Fort C.F. Smith. 3 forts, driven like wedges into the center of Lakota territory. The Lakota response was led by a man who had not previously been the most famous of the Plains leaders, but who would emerge from this conflict as the most celebrated military figure in the history of Lakota-American relations: Red Cloud, Mapia Luta, and Oglala Lakota. Red Cloud was a different kind of leader from Sitting Bull or Crazy Horse. He was a brilliant politician as well as a formidable military strategist. He understood power in its multiple dimensions: military, diplomatic, psychological. He was also, unusually for a Lakota leader of his generation, someone who was willing to travel east and speak in person to American politicians and public audiences, to make the Lakota case in American forums. But in the years of the Bozeman Trail conflict, Red Cloud was a military leader, and he was extraordinarily effective. The strategy he employed was not the straightforward pitched battle. It was a campaign of attrition, constant pressure on the forts, ambushes of woodcutting and hay-cutting parties, the steady grinding down of the Army's morale and resources. The soldiers at Fort Phil Kearny, in particular, were under almost daily attack. They could barely leave the fort's walls without risking an ambush. The commanding officer, Colonel Henry Carrington, was a meticulous administrator but not a fighting soldier, and the situation nearly broke him. The decisive moment came on December 21, 1866. A small decoy force of Lakota warriors, led, as it happened, by Crazy Horse, who had already demonstrated a gift for this kind of tactical deception, drew a column of 81 soldiers outside the protection of Fort Phil Kearny by appearing to be a small raiding party threatening a wood train. The column's commander, Captain William Fetterman, had reportedly boasted that with 80 good men he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation. He rode over Lodge Trail Ridge with exactly 80 men. On the other side, 2,000 warriors were waiting. Fetterman and every one of his 80 soldiers died. It was, until 1876, the worst defeat the Army had ever suffered on the plains. The Fetterman Fight, or the Battle of 100 Slain, as the Lakota called it, accounting for the number by their own reckoning, sent shock through the United States. The government's confidence that the plains could be secured by a few forts and a regiment of soldiers was badly shaken. A peace commission was organized. Negotiations began. Red Cloud held out. He refused to sign anything while soldiers remained in the forts along the Bozeman Trail. The negotiations dragged on through 1867. The government prevaricated. Red Cloud remained patient and immovable. The raids continued. Finally, in 1868, the government conceded. The Army would abandon the forts. The Bozeman Trail would be closed. The Powder River country would be designated as unceded Indian Territory. The Black Hills and the land west of the Missouri River would be part of the Great Sioux Reservation. The Lakota would be entitled to hunt in the unceded territories as long as the buffalo were sufficient to justify the chase. Red Cloud signed the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 only after the last soldier had evacuated the last fort. He watched Fort Phil Kearny burn, set alight by Lakota warriors within hours of the soldiers' departure. He had won. Completely. Unambiguously. The United States of America had signed a treaty on terms dictated by the Lakota. It was one of the most remarkable military and diplomatic victories any indigenous nation had ever achieved against the United States government. And yet the peace that followed was uneasy. Not all Lakota leaders had signed. Sitting Bull had not signed. He did not believe in treaties with a government that had repeatedly broken them. Some of the younger warriors were impatient with any form of accommodation. The reservation itself, however generously defined on paper, was already being encroached upon. And the ground was not stable. The buffalo were declining. Not catastrophically yet, but the decline was visible to anyone who paid attention. The emigrant trails and the expanding railroads were beginning to fragment the great herds. Hunters shooting buffalo from the windows of trains as sport were already a feature of the plains. The market for buffalo hides in the East was growing, drawing professional hide hunters onto the plains in increasing numbers. The world that the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was meant to protect was already being eaten away at the edges. And then, in 1874, something happened that would make everything that followed almost inevitable. Part 10, The Black Hills, the Gold, and the Breaking of the World. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the Pahasapa. The Black Hills. Think about what they look like in late summer. The slopes are covered in ponderosa pine, dark, resinous, with their distinctive long needles and a smell that is one of the most beautiful smells on earth: warm resin, sun-heated bark, the ghost of rain from 2 days ago still lingering in the shadowed hollows beneath the trees. The rock outcrops are gray and pink granite, ancient and smoothed by time. Small streams run clear and cold through the valleys. Deer move through the edge of the tree line in the early morning light. The Black Hills had been guaranteed to the Lakota by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 as the western boundary of the Great Sioux Reservation. They were sacred. They were home. They were, the treaty promised, inviolable. No white person was to enter the reservation without the consent of the Lakota. In the summer of 1874, the Army sent an expedition into the Black Hills. It was led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. The expedition had multiple stated purposes: geological survey, route reconnaissance, the identification of possible fort sites. But its most significant discovery was announced in the newspapers before the expedition had even returned: gold. In the creek beds, in the soil of the hills, scattered like a rumor made tangible. Gold. The word hit the country like a signal fire. The United States was in the middle of an economic depression. The Panic of 1873 had bankrupted thousands of businesses and thrown hundreds of thousands of people out of work. Gold in the Black Hills meant hope. It meant a way out of poverty. It meant the future. Prospectors began entering the Black Hills almost immediately, in violation of the treaty, in violation of the Army's own orders to keep them out. The Army made half-hearted attempts to remove them. They came back. More of them. Then more again. By 1875, there were hundreds of prospectors in the hills. By early 1876, there were thousands. The Lakota watched this with a rising anger that was also a rising grief. These hills were not simply territory. They were the center of the world. They were the place of origin. They were the home of the dead, the source of vision, the heart of everything the Lakota understood themselves to be. The prospectors scrambling through the creek beds were not simply trespassers. They were desecrating something sacred. The government knew it had a problem. The treaty was being violated by American citizens, openly, and the Army could not or would not stop it. A commission was sent in 1875 to try to purchase or release the Black Hills from the Lakota. Red Cloud and Spotted Tail, both of whom had become reservation leaders by this point and both of whom understood something of American political realities, named a price so high that the government could not accept it. The young warriors who gathered outside the council meetings made their position clear without words. They were armed, they were angry, and they were not going to agree to any sale. The commission returned east without an agreement. What happened next in Washington was, in its casual brutality, deeply revealing of the dynamics at play. In November of 1875, President Ulysses Grant held a secret meeting at the White House. The details of this meeting were not recorded officially, but its effects were quickly apparent. Within weeks, the Army received new orders: stop enforcing the exclusion of settlers from the Black Hills. Allow the gold rush to proceed. The treaty would be allowed to become a dead letter in practice, while being maintained on paper long enough for the government to find a justification to renegotiate it. And then, in December of 1875, the government sent ultimatums to the Lakota bands living in the unceded Powder River Territory, the bands that had not settled on the reservation, the bands led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. These bands were required, by order of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, to report to the reservation agencies by January 31, 1876, or be considered hostile. The deadline was not realistic even in purely logistical terms. Many of the bands were wintering deep in the Powder River country, hundreds of miles from the nearest agency. The winter of 1875–76 was bitter. Moving hundreds of people across frozen plains in the dead of winter was not simply difficult, it was dangerous. The runners carrying the ultimatum did not even reach some of the camps before the deadline expired. But the realism of the deadline was not, in truth, the point. The point was to create a legal pretext. Once the January 31 deadline passed without compliance, the Bureau of Indian Affairs turned the matter over to the War Department. The bands that had not complied were now, officially, at war with the United States. The spring campaign of 1876 was planned. 3 columns of soldiers would converge on the Powder River country from 3 directions, from the east under General Alfred Terry, from the west under General George Crook, and from the north. They would drive the hostile bands before them, forcing them onto the reservation or into submission. What the army did not fully appreciate was what they would find when they got there. Because in the winter of 1875–76, something remarkable was happening across the northern plains. Bands that had previously lived separately were beginning to come together. The word was spreading through the camp networks, the informal but remarkably efficient communication system of the plains, that this was a time for the people to stand together. Men from the reservation agencies were quietly leaving, walking or riding west into the unceded territory to join the free bands. And Sitting Bull was dreaming. Through the winter months, Sitting Bull had been receiving visions. The visions spoke of a great gathering. A great gathering of the Lakota and their Cheyenne allies, and a great test that was coming. He held councils. He sent runners. He spoke to the spiritual powers in his prayers and listened carefully for their response. The response, when it came, was both terrifying and clarifying. In the spring of 1876, at the Sundance held on the Rosebud River, Sitting Bull performed one of the most extraordinary acts of sacrifice and prayer in his long spiritual life. He sat before the central pole for an extended period, offering small pieces of his own flesh, 100 cuts from his arms, in sacrifice to Wakantanka. And after this sacrifice, after days of fasting and prayer and dancing, he had a vision. They have no ears. They do not listen. They will not hear. And so they will be given as a gift to the people who have been listening, who have been faithful, who have kept the ceremonies and held the sacred hoop intact. Sitting Bull shared his vision with his people. The impact was profound. Part 11: The Gathering on the Greasy Grass. There is a particular kind of morning that comes in early June on the northern plains. The light arrives before the sun does, a slow brightening at the edge of the world, turning the sky from black to deep blue to a pale luminous gray, and then finally to the first thin gold of actual dawn. The air at that hour is cool enough to see your breath, cool enough to make you grateful for the warmth of your blanket or your robe, and yet there is already in it the promise of the heat that will come by midday. The dew on the grass catches the early light and makes the whole prairie shimmer. In the camps along the river the Lakota called the Greasy Grass, the river that American maps would label the Little Bighorn, the mornings of early June in 1876 were mornings of extraordinary density. The camps had grown through the late spring into something that had perhaps never been seen before on the northern plains, and might never be seen again. They had come from everywhere. From the agency's Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Pine Ridge, Rosebud warriors and families had been quietly departing for weeks, drawn westward by Sitting Bull's vision, by the drums of the coming Sundance, by the feeling that had been building all winter that this year was different. This year, the people would stand together. Families traveled in small groups at first, moving at the pace of their horse herds and their travois carrying dogs and horses, following the river systems westward through the budding cottonwood groves. A family here. A band there. Then 2 bands together. Then 3. And at each new campsite, they would find fires already burning and strangers becoming relatives in the old way, through the sharing of food, through the asking of lineage questions, through the recognition of cousins and in-laws and old friends not seen since the last great gathering. By early June, the camp on the greasy grass had grown to a size that astonished even those who were part of it. Estimates made afterward varied widely, from perhaps 8,000 people total, including warriors, women, children, and elders, to as many as 10 or 12,000. The number of fighting men alone has been estimated at anywhere from 1,500 to 4,000 or 5,000, though the precise count remains contested by historians. What is certain is that this was the largest gathering of free, non-reservation Lakota and their Cheyenne and Arapaho allies in living memory, perhaps the largest ever. The camp was organized in the Lakota way, in a great circle, but a circle so large that it stretched for nearly 3 miles along the western bank of the Little Bighorn River. Each band had its assigned position in the circle. The Hunkpapa, Sitting Bull's people, were at the southern end, the traditional position of honor, as the last defense against any attack from that direction. Moving northward along the river came the Miniconjou, the Sans Arc, the Oglala, the Blackfoot Sioux, and at the far northern end, the Cheyenne. The Cheyenne were important allies, and their presence at this gathering was both numerically and spiritually significant. The Cheyenne and the Lakota had been closely allied for decades, their friendship cemented through intermarriage, through shared ceremony, and through a long history of fighting side by side against common enemies. In the coming battle, they would fight side by side once more. Within the great camp, life went on in all its ordinary dimensions, even as the extraordinary gathered around it. Women cooked over fires whose smoke rose in pale columns into the still June air. Children chased each other between the teepees and splashed in the shallows of the river, their laughter carrying clearly across the water. Horses, thousands of them, grazed on the rich grass of the valley floor, tended by boys who kept them from straying too far. Old men sat in groups and smoked and talked of things that had happened long ago. Young men showed off for one another and for the young women who moved past with careful, pretended indifference. Councils met. Headmen gathered and spoke. The question of what would happen when the soldiers came, because everyone knew the soldiers were coming, somewhere, sometime, was discussed with the seriousness it deserved. Sitting Bull had said the victory was promised, but he had also said something that is worth remembering. The vision showed soldiers falling into the camp, but it also carried a warning. Do not take the soldiers' possessions. Do not plunder the fallen. If the people showed greed, the gift of the vision might be forfeited. This warning would echo in the days to come. In the days just before the battle, there had already been a significant engagement. On June 17, 1876, a large force of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors under the leadership of Crazy Horse had encountered General George Crook's column on the Rosebud River, about 30 miles to the southeast. The Battle of the Rosebud, or the Fight on the Rosebud, as the Lakota called it, had been a fierce, day-long engagement that ended with Crook's column retreating southward and withdrawing from the campaign altogether, at least temporarily. The Battle of the Rosebud was, by any measure, a significant Lakota and Cheyenne military achievement. Crook had brought the largest single force of the three converging columns, over 1,000 soldiers, and he had been fought to a standstill by warriors who were, by most accounts, substantially outnumbered. The battle demonstrated something that Crazy Horse understood intuitively, that aggressive, fluid, unpredictable tactics could neutralize the advantages of disciplined military formation. After the Rosebud, the camp moved westward, crossing to the Little Bighorn Valley. The grass was good there. The valley was wide and sheltered. The cottonwood groves along the river provided shade and fuel, and the gentle, constant whisper of leaves in the afternoon breeze. The people rested. They had fought. They had won. They held ceremonies of thanksgiving. The warriors who had distinguished themselves at the Rosebud were honored. The camp settled into the rhythm of summer life on the plains, the rhythm of life as it had been lived for generations, the rhythm that the political forces gathering to the east and north and south were intent on ending forever. What the camp did not know, what no one in the camp could have known, was that on the morning of June 25, just days after the great gathering had made the valley feel like the center of the world it was, a force of cavalry was crossing the divide to the east, looking down at them. And at the head of that cavalry rode the officer whose name the Lakota would come to know by a different term entirely. They called him Pihin-Hanska. Long hair. George Armstrong Custer. But before we come to that day, before we allow the events of June 25, 1876 to break into the long, warm, dreaming life of this story, let us stay a little longer with the world we have been building. Let us understand, as fully as we can, what was at stake. What had been given. What was being defended. Because the battle itself, when it comes in another story, on another night, will only make its full weight felt if we understand the world it happened within. The camp on the greasy grass was not simply a military encampment waiting for a fight. It was a living world. It was the Lakota civilization at something close to its most complete expression, gathered, ceremonially whole, spiritually awake, connected to the land and to one another and to the sacred powers that move through all things. And it was a world that knew, with the deep, quiet knowledge of people who have been watching the horizon for a generation, that it was under threat. Not all threats look like soldiers on a hilltop. Some of the deepest threats arrive slowly, like winter approaching, the days shortening by minutes, the light changing almost imperceptibly, until one morning you wake and find the world white and silent and changed. The buffalo were declining. Everyone in that camp knew it. The great herds that had once stretched beyond seeing in every direction were smaller now, more fragmented, pushed into narrower ranges by the encroaching settlements, by the railroads, by the hide hunters who were working the southern plains in devastating numbers and who would soon turn their attention northward. The reservation system was growing. Each year, more Lakota were living on the agencies, drawing rations, becoming dependent on the government for the food that the buffalo used to provide so abundantly. The agencies were not simply geographical locations, they were nodes in a system designed, with varying degrees of explicit awareness, to break down the cultural and economic independence of the Plains peoples and make them manageable. The children at the agencies were being sent to schools where speaking Lakota was forbidden, where the hair, important in Lakota culture as a marker of identity and mourning and spiritual state, was cut, where every visible element of Lakota life was systematically replaced with the visible elements of American rural life: cotton clothes, wooden frame buildings, the English language, Christian prayer. All of this, the agencies, the schools, the declining buffalo, the broken treaties, formed the backdrop against which the great camp on the greasy grass should be understood. This was not simply a military resistance. It was an act of cultural survival. The people in that camp, every family in every one of those thousands of teepees stretching for miles along the river, were living proof that the Lakota way of life still existed. That the sacred hoop was still whole. That Wakantanka still received the prayers of the people and the people still knew how to offer them. To understand why so many warriors fought with such ferocity on June 25 and 26, 1876, you have to understand what they were fighting to protect. Not territory, exactly. Not even sovereignty, in the abstract political sense. They were fighting for the world inside that camp. For their mothers and grandmothers and their children. For the sound of the drums and the smell of the cook fires and the particular quality of light on the river at dawn. For the right to wake up in the morning in a world that was still theirs. That is what they were fighting for. And they won. For one day, on one patch of golden grass above one river on the northern plains, with the summer sun moving across the enormous sky overhead, they won. What came after, the consequences, the retribution, the long slow erosion that followed, is a different story, for a different night. Tonight, we stay with what was. With the world before the breaking. With the fire and the circle and the stars. Part 12, The World That Was, Legacy, Memory, and the Enduring Nation. There is something that happens when you have been listening to history for a long time, in the quiet and the dark, with nothing between you and the story but the gentle current of words. The distance collapses. The history of the Lakota people before Little Bighorn is not a tragedy waiting to happen. That framing, the framing of inevitable defeat, of a people moving toward their own destruction, is one of the most persistent and most damaging misrepresentations in American historical memory. The Lakota were not a tragedy. They are a people. Complex, vital, brilliant, divided, spiritual, practical, full of humor and grief and ambition and love, like all human peoples everywhere and in all times. What happened to the Lakota after Little Bighorn, and after the Army's retaliatory campaigns of 1876 and 1877, was not the natural conclusion of an inevitable story. It was the result of specific choices made by specific people in positions of power, choices that could have been made differently. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 could have been honored. The Black Hills could have been protected. The buffalo could have been managed as a shared resource rather than systematically exterminated. The children in the reservation schools could have been educated without the destruction of their language and their identity. None of these alternative paths required extraordinary moral heroism, they required only ordinary decency and the honoring of legal obligations that the United States had voluntarily undertaken. That those paths were not taken is a historical fact. That the Lakota survived anyway, that they are here now, on reservations that contain fractions of their original territory, practicing their ceremonies, speaking their language, raising their children with knowledge of who they are, is also a historical fact, and one that deserves to be held alongside the tragedy without being used to minimize it. The Lakota survived Wounded Knee, where in December of 1890, soldiers of the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, opened fire on a camp of Minneconjou Lakota led by Bigfoot, killing somewhere between 250 and 300 men, women, and children in the snow. They survived the allotment policies of the late 19th century, which broke the reservation into individual parcels and sold the surplus to white settlers, reducing the land base by millions of acres. They survived the boarding school era, which took generations of children from their families and tried to excise every trace of Lakota identity from them. They survived because the things that make the Lakota who they are, the language, the ceremonies, the values, the stories proved more resilient than the policies designed to eliminate them. The sun dance, which was banned by the federal government for decades, was never fully extinguished. It was performed quietly, in secret, in remote places where government agents were unlikely to find it. The language was spoken in homes, whispered between elders and grandchildren, carried forward in the mouths of people who refused to let it die. The sacred stories, the story of White Buffalo Calf Woman, the story of the creation, the stories of the great leaders and the great battles, were told and retold through all the years of suppression. And the land itself remembered. The Black Hills are still there. The pine-covered mountains still rise from the prairie in that sudden, improbable way, still dark against the afternoon sky, still smelling of resin and rain and ancient stone. The Little Bighorn battlefield is still there, maintained now as a national monument, with new memorial structures that honor the Lakota and Cheyenne dead alongside the soldiers who fell that day, a recent and overdue recognition of the complexity of what happened on that ground. The legal battle over the Black Hills has never been fully resolved. In 1980, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Black Hills had been taken from the Lakota illegally, in violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty, and awarded a settlement of over $100 million. The Lakota nations refused the money. They refused it because they were not asking for money, they were asking for the land itself. The money sits in a federal trust account, accumulating interest, untouched, as a kind of ongoing testament to the unfinished nature of the conversation. The Lakota position is simple and profound. The Black Hills are not for sale. They were never for sale. The Pahasapa is the center of the world. It cannot be purchased. That position has been maintained, consistently and with remarkable steadiness, for nearly a century and a half. It is, in its own way, an act of cultural endurance as powerful as any battle, the refusal, maintained across generations, to accept that what was taken is gone forever. Tonight, we have traveled through a great arc of time and place and story. We began at the 7 council fires, that first, beautiful image of the people gathering around the warmth of flame, bound together by language and kinship and shared ceremony. We walked through the sacred geography of the Black Hills, feeling the particular quality of that sudden, dark elevation rising from the Golden Plain. We felt the trembling of the earth as 60 million buffalo moved across it in their vast seasonal migrations, and we watched as the Lakota built an entire civilization around the gift of that immense, warm, generous creature. We watched the horse arrive and remake the world the morning when the children of Jumping Badger's generation woke to find that their whole range of possibility had expanded beyond anything their grandparents could have imagined. We sat inside the teepee, in the amber light of the fire, and listened to the council. We understood the warrior societies and the women's authority and the deep, serious commitment to ceremony that ran through every aspect of Lakota life. We watched the first contacts, the smallpox moving invisibly ahead of the European advance, the fur traders arriving at the river bends with their metal pots and their unstated implications, Lewis and Clark looking at the Lakota along the Missouri with the eyes of a government that had already decided what the future would look like. We watched the first treaty and its almost immediate violation. We watched Conquering Bear die in the afternoon light of an August day in 1854, trying to prevent a conflict that a single arrogant lieutenant had decided to start. We watched General Harney's dawn attack on the sleeping village at Ash Hollow and tried to hold the knowledge of what that meant, not as policy, but as human experience. We watched Red Cloud wage the most successful military campaign any indigenous nation had ever mounted against the United States Army, and we watched him sign the 1868 treaty with the satisfaction of a man who had gotten what he came for. The forts burned. The trail closed. The Powder River country was safe. For a time. We watched the gold rush into the Black Hills, that golden, catastrophic discovery that made the promises of 1868 economically inconvenient, and we watched the government quietly decide that inconvenient promises need not be kept. And we arrived at the great camp on the greasy grass, the gathering that was also a homecoming, the military alliance that was also a ceremony, the last large free expression of the world that the Lakota had built over 100 years of life on the northern plains. That camp contained everything. Every value and every story and every ceremonial fire and every grandmother's hands working the hide and every boy's first writing lesson and every young man's dream and every elder's quiet wisdom. It contained the whole world of the Lakota people, pressed together along 3 miles of riverbank in the long, golden days of a Montana summer. It is important, as we come toward the end of this particular telling, to be clear about what the battle that followed meant. The Battle of Little Bighorn was a military victory for the Lakota and their allies. Custer's immediate command was destroyed. 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry, over 200 men, died on the hills above the river. The Army's campaign was disrupted, temporarily set back, forced to reconsider its assumptions. But the battle did not change the larger trajectory. Within a year, most of the free bands had been forced onto the reservation. Sitting Bull took his people north into Canada and lived there for several years, but eventually returned and surrendered in 1881. Crazy Horse surrendered at Fort Robinson in May of 1877, and was killed there in September of the same year, stabbed with a bayonet during an attempt to put him in the guardhouse, in circumstances that remain disputed but that the Lakota understood, immediately and clearly, as murder. The world before the battle, the world we have been visiting tonight, did not survive Little Bighorn. Not in its old form. The reservation system closed around the remaining free bands with the swiftness of a hand closing around water. The buffalo herds collapsed entirely in the early 1880s, destroyed in a few years by the systematic commercial hunting that the Army had consciously encouraged as a way to undermine the Plains people's economic independence. But the things the world before the battle contained, the knowledge, the values, the language, the ceremony, the deep and enduring love for the land and for one another, those things did not die with the buffalo or with the free life of the plains. They went underground. They went into the whispered stories between grandmothers and grandchildren. They went into the ceremonies performed in secret, far from the eyes of government agents. They went into the memories of very old men and women who had been young in the time of the great camp, and who spent the remaining decades of their lives holding that memory carefully, like a coal kept alive under ash, until the world changed enough to let the fire breathe again. Today, there are roughly 170,000 people who identify as Lakota. They live primarily in South Dakota and Nebraska, on the Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, and other reservations. Some live in cities. They are one of the largest Native American nations in the country. The Black Hills case is still open, in every meaningful sense. The land is still there. The people who love it are still there. The conversation about what justice looks like, nearly a century and a half after the treaty was broken, is still ongoing. That conversation is not comfortable. It does not have an easy resolution. It asks Americans to hold the complexity of their own history, the beauty of the land alongside the cost of acquiring it, the genuine achievements of a nation alongside the genuine crimes that accompanied those achievements. History that asks that of us is the most important kind. It is the kind that makes us more fully human, more fully awake to the weight and the consequence of the choices made in our name, and to the choices we ourselves will make. But that is thinking work. And tonight, we have been listening work. Receiving work. The gentle, receptive work of letting the past speak to us across the distance and the dark. The people of the 7 council fires. The sacred hills at the center of the world. The vast, slow migration of the buffalo across the golden grass. The horse arriving in the early morning light, changing everything. The fire in the center of the camp circle, its smoke rising in a slow column toward the opening at the top of the teepee and then dispersing into the enormous, star-filled night. These images belong to you now. Carry them gently. Closing meditation. The night is very quiet now. Wherever you are lying, feel the support beneath you. The mattress, the pillow, the weight of the blanket holding you gently from above. Your body is heavy. Your breath is slow. Somewhere far away, on the northern plains, the grass is bending in a wind that has been blowing across the landscape since long before anyone had words for it. The stars overhead are the same stars that watched over the great camp on the greasy grass. The same stars that lit the councils and the ceremonies and the long migrations across the golden prairie. They have not moved, or rather, they have moved in exactly the same slow, circular way they have always moved, tracing their ancient paths above the sleeping earth. The world we have visited tonight was real. Its people were real. Their love for their land and for each other was real. Their prayers were real. Their courage was real. Their grief was real. History is made of real things. Real mornings and real fires and real children laughing at the water's edge. Real councils where real people tried their best to make wise decisions in a world that was becoming, year by year, less predictable and more dangerous. What is asked of us, as listeners, as the people who receive these stories, is simply this, that we hold them with care. That we do not reduce them to symbols or lessons or simple stories with easy moral conclusions. That we allow the people we have been learning about tonight to remain people, complicated, specific, irreducibly human, rather than becoming abstractions in someone else's larger narrative. The Lakota people asked that question of the world, are you going to listen? Do you have ears for what we are trying to tell you? Tonight, you have listened. Let that be enough for now. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts dissolve like smoke in still air. Let the images of the story, the fire, the circle, the horses moving through the tall grass, the dark line of pine-covered hills rising from the golden plain, let them soften and blur at the edges, the way all visions do as sleep approaches. You are safe. You are warm. You are held. The stars are turning slowly overhead. The wind moves through the grass. The river runs clear and cold over smooth stones in the dark. Sleep now. Gently. Completely. The story will be here when you return. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.